When I was about 11 or 12, there were a few times that I felt really free. Not too many. This was a farm that I grew up on. This was always some work required. If I had nothing to do, my dad generally had in mind something for me to do. A few years later, I was on the high school debate team, and I had an attack of conscience because I didn't feel that I could with integrity argue both sides of that year's proposition, which, as I recall, was about abolishing the death penalty, which I was in favor of. So I quit the team, and now that my Saturday mornings were free, my dad suddenly realized that I could be well used mucking out the calf pens. I soon decided that I didn't have to feel quite such a strong sense of integrity, and I returned to the debate team. There was always something pressing to do unless you could get yourself free. So every once in a while I would sneak off to the haymow with a book and just spend hours reading, especially during the summer. I remember reading Vance Packard's The Hidden Persuaders and Conrad Loren's King Solomon's Ring, New Light on Animals' Ways, among others. That to me was freedom, glorious freedom. Never lasted too long, but it was wonderful when I could. And curiously enough, both of these books that I recall spoke about freedom. Vance Packard about how our freedom to choose is curtailed by what he called the hidden persuaders of Madison Avenue, celebrated of late in the TV series Mad Men, which some of you may have watched. And Conrad Lorenz was talking about the constraints that our genetic heritage from the animal kingdom put on our freedom as well. I still feel a strong desire to experience that kind of freedom to do whatever I want to do. Some mornings I have a stubborn commitment not to do anything that anyone else wants me to. So a gentle reminder that the cats need to be fed, or that the garbage is full, or that I have to be somewhere for something, doctor's appointment, coming down to the office here for work, going on a museum outing with friends, anything comes to seem like an imposition on my freedom. And there are times when something really needs to get done, and I choose instead to demonstrate and exercise my freedom by procrastinating. I'm sure I'm alone in that. Any of you ever do that? It's one way of asserting freedom, but it doesn't always end up feeling that good, I've found. So freedom is a deliciously difficult matter to pin down. We dream of having perfect freedom, and we struggle for freedom for everyone, and yet we're constrained on all sides by some obligations that we've freely chosen, and by the limits of our genetic heritage, our upbringing, and our education. You may be starting to feel that I'm doing a bait and switch on you this morning. Everything else we've done talks about freedom for other people, like that video, for example, and that's our month's theme. And now I'm talking about the freedom to be able to skip out on work and read a book. What about those great struggles that we just saw enacted? What about social justice? What about other people's needs? We'll get to that soon enough. And we'll certainly be talking about that sense of freedom in our joint service with Messiah on June 28th. We've taken as our theme for that service, remembering 3 specific struggles for freedom, all of which were in the video. Freedom for women, as represented by the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. The struggle for the freedom for all to vote, represented by Selma in 1965. And freedom for our LBGT brothers and sisters from harassment and oppression, represented by the Stonewall Uprising of 1969, whose anniversary, as Pastor Walker pointed out to me, happens to fall on June 28th. Now, how many of you are going to join us for that service? It's in Brockton at Messiah. There's something that the Obama campaign realized, which is it's easy for people to say they're in favor of something. But if you ask them specifically, are you going to the polls? And then further, what's your plan to get there? People are more likely to do that. So how many of you are going? And how many of you have a plan to get there? That's how we build commitment. We hope to see you there. Freedom for others is important. It's not to be forgotten. Each of us also struggle, though, for freedom in our own lives. And as it turns out, my freedom and yours is an ancient and contested issue. And the language we use to speak about it is varied and sometimes controversial. I've gone to services at Messiah the past few Sundays when I was not preaching here at First Parish, so I could get a better sense of the congregation that we're sharing our service with, have a sense of how they worship, and what kind of language they use. And I was struck by this responsive reading on May 24th. Lord, you have set us free, not free to do what we please, but free to love you with our whole hearts gladly, free to love our neighbors as we do ourselves. God, we need to know your freedom. Free us from our selfishness. Free us from our indifference to the plight of the poor. Free us to love and serve you and our neighbors with all our being. Now, some of the language in that responsive reading might not be comfortable for some of you, but it illuminates the first aspect of personal freedom that I want to hold up, that we can give away our freedom. In Baptist theology, this loss might be described as a result of original sin, but it also references the ways in which we can enslave ourselves. We can get trapped by a series of our own choices, most obviously when we become addicted in some way to drugs, from sugar to tobacco to heroin. Unless we forget, vast areas of these United States have fallen under the sway of heroin addiction over the past few years, largely because of misuse of other opioids like OxyContin. It's had devastating effects in Taunton, where there have been deaths from overdoses, beatings, families broken up, and so on. But it's reached into many of our communities around here as well. And once we become addicted to drugs or alcohol or even tobacco, it can come to seem as though we no longer have the freedom not to continue using them. Where, in such a case, is our supposed free will? The rabbis who reformulated a new understanding of Judaism after the temple was destroyed, 70 AD, about 40 years after Jesus was crucified, were preoccupied with the issue of freedom, our freedom to choose. And they were convinced by the stories in the Torah that human beings have been granted freedom to choose for themselves whether to do good or to do evil. In every instance, in every situation, they argued, human beings can choose between the good impulse and the evil impulse. But the rabbis faced a difficult counterexample in the book of Exodus, where it is said that God hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not let the children of Israel go free until his own son and all the firstborn of Egypt had been killed by the angel of death. So how could it be, they asked themselves, that Pharaoh was not free to decide whether to let the people go, as Moses, speaking for God, demanded? The explanation they chose was that Pharaoh was, in effect, addicted to having his own way as an absolute ruler, and that over time, his freedom had become curtailed because of a series of decisions that he himself had made. If you will, he was addicted to power and to his own ability to make arbitrary decisions, until in fact he was no longer able to choose the good and reject the evil. So addiction is one way that we can lose our freedom. Now, it could be argued that some people are born with a greater disposition to kinds of addiction than others. Alcoholism seems to run through some families, and that's undoubtedly true. But there are some who are predisposed in this way to addiction who manage to retain their freedom despite that, despite their genes, while others succumb. So even here, as the rabbi said, there is freedom to choose, at least during the early stages of plunging into addiction. John Steinbeck explores a second sense of freedom in his novel, East of Eden. The title is derived from the end of chapter 3 of Genesis, where Adam and Eve are cursed and expelled from the garden to a place east of Eden. The protagonist of the novel, Adam Trask, gets embroiled in a conversation sparked by his own first name about the sons of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. You all know that story. Cain makes his living as a farmer raising grain, while Abel is a herdsman raising cattle. The story is continued in Genesis 4. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. And its desire is for you, but you should rule over it." Adam Trask likes this story because it explains why all of us sin. He says that the story makes him feel better because we're descended from this. In fact, if you think about it, the Bible story would say all of us are descended from Cain, the wicked one, and none of us from Abel, the innocent one. What chance did we have? We're the children of our Father. It means we aren't the first. It's an excuse, and there aren't enough excuses in the world. But Adam's wise and trustworthy Chinese-American cook Lee becomes fascinated with this story. He says, "I think this is the best known story in the world because it is everybody's story. I think it's the symbol story of the human soul. I'm feeling my way now. Don't jump on me if I'm not clear. The greatest terror a child can have is that he is not loved, and rejection is the hell he fears. I think everyone in the world, to a large or small extent, has felt rejection. And with rejection comes anger, and with anger, some kind of crime and revenge for the rejection, and with the crime, guilt. And there is the story of mankind. One child, refused the love he craves, kicks the cat and hides his secret guilt. Another steals so that money will make him feel loved. And a third conquers the world, and always the guilt and revenge and more guilt. The human is the only guilty animal. Now wait. Therefore, I think this old and terrible story is important because it is a chart of the soul, the secret, rejected, guilty soul. And then Lee goes off to explore the meaning of should. You should rule over it. He notes that the King James Bible translates the line as "thou shalt rule over him." The American Standard renders it as "do thou rule over him," a very different nuance, one that is not a promise but an order. He engages in extensive contemplation of this word for the next 10 years. He engages 3 ancient sages, Chinese friends, and they in turn bring in a rabbi so that they can understand the exact meaning of the Hebrew. And here they strike gold. The meaning of the Hebrew is better rendered, "thou mayest rule over sin." And that makes all the difference, as he explains. The American Standard Translation orders men to triumph over sin. You can call sin ignorance in that case. The King James translation makes the promise, thou shalt, meaning men will surely triumph over sin. But the Hebrew word, the root word timshel, thou mayest, that gives a choice. Now, there are many millions in their sects and churches who feel the order, do thou, and throw their weight into obedience. And there are millions more who feel predestination in thou shalt. Nothing they may do can interfere with what will be. But thou mayest. Why, that makes a man great. That gives him stature with the gods. For in his weakness and filth and his murder of his brother, he has still the great choice. He can choose his course and fight it through and win. It's easy out of laziness, he continued, out of weakness, to throw oneself into the lap of deity saying, I couldn't help it. The way was set. But think of the glory of the choice. That makes a man a man. So freedom to choose is not a right, it's an obligation. We can overcome the anger, the desire for revenge that is born from rejection, and we must. Finally, a third approach to my freedom and yours. The notion of absolute freedom for each individual that's so important in our contemporary life is actually an illusion. Much of modern liberal reasoning starts with the notion that each of us is completely free as an individual, and that we then enter into a contract with one another to promote each our own better interests. So it follows that the only real restraint we should permit on our conduct is doing something that'll hurt somebody else. And that leads the way to expressive individualism, to maximizing my own satisfaction, provided only that I don't actually hurt somebody else. It's a great context for encouraging self-indulgence, for buying what will satisfy our desires, those hidden persuaders again. Hence the Chase Freedom Card. If you have this credit card, you can be truly free to do whatever your heart desires. But this notion of individual autonomy is in fact false. We're each born into a society, into a family, what Martin Luther King Jr. calls a network of mutuality. Just like our story about the body this morning. Every part is interdependent. The world around us is an interconnected web of all existence, as our seventh principle puts it, and we too are part of the web. None of us is perfectly free. All of us are bound up in relationship from the time that we're born. And that means that what each of us does affects all. Inside our own web of relationships, we are indeed free. And sometimes we can experience that wonderful freedom I remember from childhood. But inevitably, we have to come back to the obligations that we've chosen, that are imposed upon us, of those we love and those who love us, and to the society and to the web of all existence of which we are only a small part. In the words of the responsive reading from Messiah that I referenced earlier, we're free but not free to do what we please, but free to love with our whole hearts gladly, free to love our neighbors as we do ourselves. So then, freedom can be lost through addiction, through habitual bad choices, through laziness. To control this risk, it can be useful to exercise our freedom by sometimes denying our impulses and doing things we don't want to do, not out of necessity, but our own free choice. I think that's one of the reasons why so many of our religious traditions have called on us to fast on occasion, to deny ourselves the immediate gratification of eating by choosing freely to exercise our will in a manner contrary to our desire for the sake of strengthening our will, our freedom to choose. And freedom means that we can overcome the impulse to anger and revenge to which Cain succumbed in Steinbeck's story. To strengthen ourselves against those impulses It helps if we work to overcome the power of our immediate, urgent response to what happens to us and what others do to us. David Foster Wallace puts it this way: the really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline, and being able truly to care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad petty, unglamorous ways every day. That is real freedom. And finally, we need to learn to understand our role in the web of relationship of which we are a part. We have inherited some aspects of ourselves through our genes and our upbringing, but we have freedom within those constraints to choose. We can't be whatever we want, do whatever we want, or have whatever we want. Each of us can, however, choose to live out fully the life that we have been given. In the words of Forrest Church's mantra, we can be who we are, do what we can, want what we have. That way lies true freedom. Amen. And may it be so.